Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Session 2, Using Screener Data to Support Literacy Growth. My name is Sarah Stolman. I am a K-5 Literacy PD Specialist here at the Louisiana Department of Education, and I'm here with Natalie Kleber, our Middle School and High School PD Specialist. Today, what we're going to talk about is how you can use screener data to support literacy growth in all students. Before we begin, however, it's important for us to understand the mission of Louisiana literacy, which is that Louisiana students will have improved literacy outcomes through high-quality instruction and interactions by an effective teacher who is supported by both leaders and families. To this end, our 4 pillars guide that work. We know that it is essential to set and monitor meaningful literacy goals for all students. We provide high-quality explicit instruction, interventions, and extensions to all students. We ensure that all people who are responsible for providing instruction and/or support for students' literacy development receive ongoing professional growth. And we know that this work is best done with the active involvement of families. We also know that improved student outcomes are dependent on effective practices, effective implementation of those practices, and proper enabling contexts. So we think about the conditions. Do we provide our teachers with enough time to do the work that they need to ensure that students are proficient readers? Do we have a long enough literacy block? Do we provide the support that's needed to accomplish these goals? All of these things are essential for improved student outcomes, and this is reflected in this active implementation formula. Now, the outcome for this session is that you all will be able to understand what the indicators of the literacy screener look like and how you can develop student proficiency among these indicators within your high-quality instructional materials. So we want you to understand that everything that you need to provide this support to your students is embedded in your high-quality instructional materials, and effective implementation of those materials will ensure that your students are receiving the instruction and the support that they need to be proficient readers. Now, why are we having this conversation? Well, universal screening has become mandatory as a result of legislation at all K-3 schools, and it will soon be a part of teacher and school accountability. And it's not always clear how the core curriculum addresses the skills addressed in this screener. So oftentimes there may be some confusion about why nonsense words aren't explicitly taught in the core curriculum, and yet they're assessed on the screener. This is the reason for this session today, to explain these different things and to ensure that everyone has a clear sense for how the screener aligns to the curriculum. Now, although we are talking about a screener, and when we think screener, we often think grades K through 3, all topics discussed today will apply to all grade levels, although there really is a target audience in each section. Screeners, diagnostics, planning with data in mind, and comprehension and fluency practice are applicable to grades K through 12. If you have an 8th grade student who is struggling with reading fluency, they need support. They need to be diagnosed. Their reading skills need to be diagnosed. So what we will talk about today will apply to them as well. Now, it is important for us to have a very clear sense for what the indicators are for our K-3 literacy screener. Now, the first indicator that's measured only in grades K and 1 is letter naming fluency, and this is a measure of a student's ability to rapidly name letters. Now, this one is unique compared to some of the other indicators in that letter naming fluency is not essential for proficient reading. However, letter naming fluency is highly correlated with proficient reading. That said, if students are not achieving proficiency on this particular indicator, it's something to watch, but probably not the most effective target for intervention. Phoneme segmentation fluency, on the other hand, is a measure of how rapidly students can identify the sounds heard in words, meaning this is an oral exercise. They are presented with a word and they are asked to share all of the sounds that they hear in that word. They will say, tell me the sounds that you hear in the word cat. And the student should be able to automatically produce k, a, t. The student is not looking at any text. This is all done orally. And this is measured in grades K and 1 only. Nonsense word fluency, on the other hand, is a measure of students' ability to apply learned code knowledge by decoding words with no meaning. So this really is a measure of how well students can apply the code that they've learned in their high quality instruction. One thing that is often seen is that teachers will feel an impulse to have students practice reading nonsense words as part of their core curriculum. And in a sense, I understand that impulse. We know that they're measured. The screener measures nonsense word fluency. However, there's no instructional value to having students practice reading nonsense word fluency. You'll notice that in your high quality instructional materials, students are never prompted to read nonsense words. Instead, they're prompted to apply newly learned pieces of code knowledge by reading decodable texts, by completing activity pages that might contain words containing those particular sound spellings, but they're never encouraged to read nonsense words. Nonsense word fluency is an assessment tool, meaning it gives us an insight into how effectively students are applying code knowledge, but our goal is not to have our students read nonsense words. We want to see, can they apply their code knowledge, and this is an effective way to do that devoid of context. So there's no chance that the students are memorizing these words, or maybe just have memorized a word and can easily recognize it by sight, but really don't know the code that is built into that word. Word reading fluency, on the other hand, is a measure of students' automaticity in applying code knowledge by reading high frequency words with meaning. So these are real words, and these are words that most students by this point, the point of assessment, should be familiar with and should be able to read with sufficient automaticity, right? Now, this is not meant to encourage you to have your students practice reading sight words or practicing sight words. If they are automatic in applying code knowledge and they are mastering the content of your curriculum, your students will do just fine with word reading fluency. But it is a measure of students' ability to read real words. Now, this particular indicator is not found in other screeners. And so this may be a new indicator for you. Oh, let me go back. Nonsense word fluency and word reading fluency are both measured from grades K through 3. So you'll see that the complexity increases as students progress. But these are indicators that are measured in grades K, 1, 2, and 3. Now, beginning in first grade, we will begin to assess oral reading fluency. And this is a measure of students' reading fluency, which is a measure of their reading rate and their reading accuracy, and to some extent, their reading prosody or expression. Students read passages and their reading rate and accuracy are compared to national grade level norms, and you will get an indication of whether or not your student is reading with sufficient fluency compared to grade level peers to comprehend the texts that they should be able to comprehend by that grade level. Maze is a measure of students' reading comprehension. So students will read a short passage, um, and then they will fill in missing words out of a selection of three by identifying the words that make the most sense. So a lot like nonsense word fluency, Maze is an effective assessment tool, but not an instructional practice. We want our students to be able to comprehend what they read. Maze gives us information on whether or not the students can make sense of what they're reading by filling in the correct word, but there's no instructional value to completing Maze passages. Fourth grade students will also be screened in both ORF and Maze. Now, as we mentioned before, it is very important to set literacy goals, to both set and monitor literacy goals. Setting meaningful goals for student progress is a way to ensure that your work instructionally is effective in supporting students' literacy growth. The literacy screener will be a valuable tool for setting long-term goals for student growth. You may have students who enter your class and at beginning of year are identified as reading below benchmark, but your goal should be that by the end of the year, all of your students will be reading at or above benchmark. For students in grades K through 3, the zones of growth can provide educators with an easy way to set individualized literacy goals, review growth percentiles, and evaluate students' progress. If you don't have access to zones of growth, for students in grades 1 through 12, goals can also be established using the Hasbrook and Tyndall oral reading fluency norms. These norms ensure all students or provide you with information to ensure that all students are able to read at the 50th percentile for their grade level with at least 95% accuracy. To accomplish this sort of goal setting, what you would do is you would listen to all of your students read. You give them 1 minute to read a grade level passage. You count how many words correct they've read. You deduct the number of errors. So if they read 65 words, but they had 5 errors, that means their words correct per minute would be 60. Now that would put a child below the 95th. That would put a child below 95% accuracy, that particular score. But say we had a student who read 100 words correct per minute and had 2 errors. That means they would have 98% accuracy and 98 words correct per minute. Your goal, based on these Hasbrook and Tyndall norms, can be to ensure that all of your students achieve at least the 50th percentile for their grade level by the end of the year. Now, these goals can be adjusted as students are progress monitored. It's often suggested that students are progress monitored every week, every 2 weeks if possible, and you can see if they're making sufficient progress. If students are not making progress, you may need to evaluate the interventions that you're providing or the support that you're providing in order to ensure that students are making the progress that they need to get to that 50th percentile with at least 95% accuracy. Now, once your baseline benchmark data has been entered into the data platform, if you're using zones of growth will help you to identify an individualized learning goal for each student. You will select the desired rate of growth. It can be average, above average, or ambitious growth. And the system will automatically calculate the corresponding learning goal relative to the student's baseline score. It will also indicate whether the specified rate of growth is sufficient to reach the end of the year benchmark goal. If you're using the Hasbrook and Tyndall fluency norms, you will assess reading fluency weekly or bi-weekly to determine whether or not a student is making satisfactory progress. After each progress monitoring cycle, you should determine if your students are making satisfactory progress towards achieving the set goals. So for example, if you are a 3rd grade teacher and your goal is to have all of your students reading at least 150 words correct per minute with 95% accuracy, and you have a student who is reading 100 words correct per minute at the beginning of the year with 95% accuracy, you know that their rate has to increase by 50 words correct per minute. So if you have 25 weeks in your school year, that means that the average rate of growth would be about 2 words correct per minute growth per week. Now, students are not going to grow at that perfect rate of 2 words correct per minute, but some weeks you will see that they grow by 10 words correct, and then they may dip a little and then go up. But the trajectory must be there, and the monitoring should ensure that students are making the growth that they need to achieve that goal by the end of the year. If they're growing by 1 word correct every 2 weeks for 14 weeks, they're really not on track to achieve the goal that you have set. And so you may want to evaluate the instruction that the student is being provided. Now, when we think about the measures of the screener, we know that these measures are very much aligned to the word recognition strands. Phonological awareness is measured by our phonemic segmentation fluency indicator. Decoding is measured by both nonsense word fluency and word reading fluency. And then sight recognition is measured by oral reading fluency. When we get into maze is the one indicator that begins to give us information on the upper strands, the red and orange strands of the rope. It tells us our students making sense of what they read. It's also somewhat of an indication of their reading fluency, as students need to be able to read enough of the passage to make the progress they need to get a benchmark score. But generally speaking, our screener indicators are measuring these lower blue and green strands of Scarborough's reading rope. Now, what you're going to do right now is you're going to pause our session. You're going to review lesson 4 in the handouts. I want you to look at what skills are addressed in this particular lesson. Where do you see these particular skills reflected in the screener measures? And how can you determine if students have mastered the skills introduced in the lesson? What is embedded in your curriculum to give you insight into a student's reading progress, right? Now, I'll allow you to pause right here and look at this lesson, and then we'll come back. Now, you have just completed reviewing the skills that were introduced in the lesson. Now, in this lesson, it's hoped that you recognize that there were multiple skills covering different strands of the reading rope and different measures of the screener. So what you will see is that at the very beginning, the very first part of the lesson had students working on phonemic awareness, right? They were listening to hear the R sound in words that were spoken to them, right? This is not a time for the flip chart to be on. This is a time where the students are just listening for and identifying when they hear that R sound in the word. Then they went to the next part of the lesson, which had them practice. They learned that AR, the letters A and R, when put together, make that R sound. They had opportunities to practice writing AR numerous times, which supports both automaticity and great handwriting. And then they had an opportunity on the back of the activity page to match words with pictures containing that AR spelling. So you can see if they can apply that spelling in words. Now, the last part of the lesson had students reading. Oh, let me go back to that. So you can see how this middle part of the lesson, the second component of the lesson, addresses both nonsense word and word reading fluency. The last part of the lesson is oral reading fluency. So the students were called upon to read aloud in the class. And this is a measure of students' reading fluency. As they're listening to read, you can be taking notes on their reading proficiency. Now, a caution here, if you have students who are still struggling with the most basic skills of phonemic awareness and are not proficient decoders, You likely wouldn't call upon them to read in front of the entire class. However, if you know that about them, you know that they need that additional support. And so during your independent small group time, you might pull those students and work on the skills that they need to move them in the direction of being proficient readers. The goal of this last part of the lesson is to give students who are proficient and moving in the direction of fluency an opportunity to practice reading aloud, but it is also a model for students who are listening to their peers reading fluently. It is not time to kind of have students who are truly not proficient readers demonstrate that in front of the class. Now, as you go through every lesson in your curriculum, you should consider which lesson components are designed to support students' success with different screener measures, just like we did. Listening for sounds and words supports students in phonemic awareness indicators, such as phonemic segmentation fluency. Learning and applying new spelling patterns supports students' phonics skills, such as nonsense word fluency and word reading fluency. And reading practice supports students' oral reading fluency. Now, the daily formative assessments that are embedded in the curriculum, the opportunities to observe what students are doing and to make notes about their reading progress, are aligned to each component of a lesson, will provide you with relevant information on a student's progression to mastery on each of the indicators of the screener. That's why it's so important to use this information, this daily formative assessment information, to guide your instruction. If you know that there are students in your class who continue to need support with phonemic segmentation, you're listening carefully during that first part of the lesson to see their progress or to provide them with that targeted support at that time. In the same sense, if you have students who are fluent readers and may just need some support with reading fluency or prosody, you're listening during that portion of the lesson where students are called upon to read fluently. This is going to help you target your support and ensure that all students are getting the support that they need to be proficient readers, and that will be reflected in higher scores on the screener. Now, if a student has needs in areas that are no longer addressed in the whole group lesson, for example, you have a second grade student who still needs support with phonemic awareness, or if students or groups of students struggle to master the content, you can find additional resources in your curriculum to target the skills for which students may need additional support. For example, in CKLA, if a student struggles to apply the newly learned AR spelling pattern, additional resources can be found in the additional supports that are listed at the end of each lesson. And if even more is needed to support the student, there are additional resources found in the assessment and remediation guide. Now, one way to use the assessment and remediation guide is to focus on the skill in which the student needs support. So if they need support reading words with that R-controlled spelling, then you find the activities linked to that. If you're using a program like Expeditionary Learning, you may also refer to previously addressed skills in earlier microphases as needed. Now I'm going to kick it over to Natalie, who is going to show what the measures look like inside our daily lessons as students enter third grade and they continue to need support with reading fluency.
Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Kleber, and I also want to talk to you about some ways that we can look to see what these measures look like inside of our daily lessons from a third grade perspective with a need for fluency. But if you were administering the DIBEL screener anyway from third grade all the way up to 12th, you would still use these same practices. So in this particular example, we're looking at a third grade guidebooks unit called Stories That Julian Tells. These are just some adjustments and differentiation for a whole class, from a whole class perspective first, and then we'll talk about small group on the next slide. So in lesson 1 of this unit, it says that the students will listen to and follow along with the read aloud of the fantastic flying books of Mr. Morris Lesmore. So as a teacher, as I'm internalizing this and planning for this lesson, and I'm thinking about the fluency needs that my students have, if there's a huge need for fluency practice, in this particular class, what are some moves that I can make as a teacher to help build fluency in this whole class environment? So one thing I can do is I can ensure students are tracking with their eyes or fingers to ensure words begin to be mapped as read. And this might look like I have the text up on the Promethean board, or if it's a unit that the students are reading from at their desks, that they have their books out, that they're not just listening to a read aloud, but they're actually tracking. And explaining to students why that's so important and letting them know it's not just about hearing the information, but seeing the words and hearing the words is going to help build their fluency because they'll recognize the word again and again. You could do a possible choral or echo read of certain sections of the story. So maybe, today you're supposed to read all of this particular section. So you might not be able to do a choral or echo of the entire section, but maybe a paragraph or two or three if you think that particular piece of the text is super important. A choral read is where you all read sentence by sentence together, and an echo read is where I read a sentence, the class reads that same sentence back to me. You could also partner read certain paragraphs or sections after an initial read. This is another great way to just reinforce hearing the words, seeing the words, and building that sight word recognition as students are getting through some of these more complex texts. So lesson 2 said for the students to reread the same text from the previous day to answer questions pertaining to details of the text. So I'm asking myself once again, how can I target fluency here? And guidebooks or any knowledge building curriculum in 3rd grade through up is going to have suggestions and recommendations for how to get through the text, but they don't know your students. So if it's prescribed that it's just a read aloud, you may need to layer some other things on there because you feel your students need that to help support the complexity of the text in that moment. So, they already read the text, they're reading it again. Sometimes I know my students would get frustrated because they're like, why are we reading this again? So the very first thing you can do to help build fluency in that is to inform students that there's actually a different purpose for reading that day and why that's important. We can let them know that even as adults, we have to reread things, and there's a different lens for reading and how we get different information out every time we do reread something and how it's going to help them. They really need to know that to buy into that particular practice. Another thing is to explain to students exactly what reading a text does for their fluency and how it helps them. So I kind of talked a little bit about that in the first bullet, letting them know what seeing the word, hearing the word repeatedly does for them, not just in your class, but outside the class, how they're going to become better readers, how it's going to help them later in school and later in life. To be a better reader, for making reading easier. Let's talk about fluency from a small group perspective now. So fluency practice in a small group, the very first thing that we're doing, and we should be dividing our students up in groups based on ability. So if students scored a certain in a certain norm range in the screener for fluency, we should have those advanced readers paired together, those benchmark students paired together below proficiency and well below. Those should each be paired for this kind of small group work. When you're in a class, a whole group setting, it's great to have heterogeneous groupings where they have different mixed ability levels. But when we're doing small group targeted intervention, it's much better if we have students that have the same needs so we can help target specific needs in those small groups. This should be, it's going to talk about group size in just a second, but modeling what good reading looks and sounds like. So most students that are struggling readers especially do not even pay attention to the title. So we're going to model reading the title, why that's important. We're going to model paying attention if it's an informational text to those captions, pictures to headings and subheadings, and model that. Paying attention to all those text features, reading with the appropriate rate and prosody, set a purpose for reading that particular day. So maybe our reading today is just to model prosody, is for you to read it back to me with the appropriate prosody, which means that you're pausing at punctuation, you're using the proper inflection in your voice when you're reading, not sounding like a robot. Maybe our purpose for reading that day is a retelling. You're going to tell me what we read about today. Maybe it's to focus on a specific grammar element. So maybe this particular text, this little paragraph or 2 paragraphs we're reading today in the small group, has some conjunctions in it. Maybe I'm modeling, why that's important after we do our read-throughs, why those elements are important, what that does for the sentence. And you could pick any piece of syntax or grammar to talk about in that kind of environment. Flexible groupings based on ability. I talked about ability already. And flexible means if somebody was below benchmark, but their progress monitoring shows that you're getting more proficient, absolutely move that student out as soon as they hit that proficiency consistently so that they can become part of their proficient group. No more than 5 students per group. You want to eventually move towards timed reading so they can see how they're developing and getting better at their words correct per minute. You want to help students set goals and track their own fluency progress. There's a lot of free graphs out there. Session 3 of our summer PD tour had some free graphs available there as well, but I would use those norm charts to look at the 50th percentile. I would set that as my goal for my students, and I would put where they initially were on that first screen or a diagnostic, and I would let them use that little bar graph to color in where they went each time we progress monitored so they can see how close they were getting to their goal. A lot of the different curricula have fluency passages embedded. Guidebooks does, but when not available, you can search other sites such as Achieve the Core, ReadWorks, News ELA, or some different free sites. You could make a piece of the text that they're reading a fluency passage if it's a high leverage piece. What I mean when I say high leverage piece is maybe this is a guidebooks unit, and our culminating writing asks them to focus on something really specific. Those kinds of where those are placed throughout the text really might be a great place to pull a fluency passage. You could search for grade level and topics as close to the text in the curriculum as possible. And by doing this, you're double dipping on that building fluency as well as building background knowledge simultaneously. One example is if I was teaching stories that Julian tells, I went into Achieve the Core. I typed in, or I think this was ReadWorks actually. I typed in, I clicked 3rd grade, I clicked fiction, and I typed in books and found fantastical elements, which was another narrative that focused on magic books. And so again, you're just double dipping. You can talk more about narrative elements there, but also reinforcing that fluency the whole time. Okay, so consider the process that you just went through to plan instruction around the measures in the screener, both from what Sarah said and what I said. Reflect on what indicators your students struggled with so far in this year or last year, and predict what students might need more support with this coming year as you go. As you're looking at the beginning of year screener data, what are some areas that more students were below proficiency level? How can you focus on those in your lessons? What resources will you need? What are some ways you can add direct and explicit instruction to your whole group lessons, even if the curriculum doesn't call those out? What will explicit and direct small group instruction look like for those skills as well? So kind of reflect on those things. Some next steps are, what are your next steps to start with the process or continue with where you are? Create a list of next steps and let us know if we can help facilitate any part of the process. Look at your curriculum assessments, whether they're formative or summative, and progress monitoring data throughout the year to determine the effectiveness of your planning. You're planning to target those individual screener measures, but is it impacting student growth? Analyze that middle of the year data to determine what adjustments you need to make at the midway point if you've been doing this since beginning of the year. So here are some different resources on the literacy screener and goal setting. A link for our literacy landing page, our literacy library, Lift, Dibbles, and then setting and monitoring literacy goals. If you have any questions or comments, always please email us at louisianaliteracy@la.gov. And y'all have a great school year.